Yellowstone 1923's harrowing true story behind Teonna Rainwater's brutal upbringing. The gripping Yellowstone prequel 1923 delves into a harrowing true story, centering on Teonna Rainwater, portrayed by Amina Neves, who is expected to be a direct ancestor of Thomas Rainwater, Gil Birmingham. The series graphically portrays her suffering at the hands of nuns in a Catholic school for Indigenous children. Although Teonna may have exacted her revenge in the show's first season, her ordeal isn't over as she continues to flee from danger. Her grim narrative reflects historical accounts of government-funded boarding schools where Indigenous children were subjected to beatings and abuse. As reported by Pajaba.com, these children were stripped of their identities, forbidden from wearing their own clothes, speaking their native language, or even using their real names. Mirroring the series, they had their hair forcibly cut and were made to adopt American religious education. The website details the tragic impact of such institutions. The children spent as many as 10 years in these schools, and once they returned to their reservations, they often had difficulty re-assimilating at home, leaving them in a sort of cultural no-man's land where they were not accepted by either Americans or the reservations. The brutal objective of these schools, as depicted in 1923, was to kill the Indian, save the man. Historical records reveal that in one Michigan school alone, over 230 children perished between 1893 and 1931. Echoing Teonna's storyline in 1923, bounties were indeed offered for the recapture of children who attempted escape. The TV series has been praised for its historically accurate depiction of the harsh realities within boarding schools established by Western settlers to forcibly assimilate Indigenous communities during America's westward expansion. Although Montana hosted only one such institution, the Fort Shaw Indian School, a greater number were found in states like Oklahoma, Minnesota, and South Dakota. Jennifer L., who portrayed Sister Mary in the show's inaugural season, spoke to Screen Rant about her character's mindset, saying, "Sister Mary is a person who believes, as the people who were running these residential schools actually did believe, that you had to kill the Indian to save the man." She added, "You had to force assimilation. You had to remove all cultural identity from these children who had been removed forcibly from their families and were living in isolation." While most of these boarding schools have since been shut down or undergone significant reforms, the legacy of mistreatment has inflicted lasting damage on those affected. Amina, the actress behind Teonna, expressed the importance of storytelling for Indigenous people to Screen Rant. Being Indigenous, it's our duty to tell our stories and to tell them as strongly, quickly, and powerfully as we can. She emphasized, "It's what we're born into, and we're storytellers from the jump." You know what I'm saying? Continuing to tell our story as honestly as we can is very important. The world of Yellowstone 1923 presents a harsh and unrelenting reality, but few storylines are as harrowing as that of Teonna Rainwater. Her brutal upbringing at the hands of a Catholic boarding school serves as a gut-wrenching reminder of the real-life atrocities committed against Indigenous children throughout history. While Teonna is a fictional character, her experiences reflect the true nightmarish ordeals endured by thousands of Native American children who were forcibly taken from their families and subjected to horrific abuse in government and church-run institutions. Her story is not just a dramatic arc, it is a reflection of a dark chapter in American history, one that demands to be acknowledged. The reality behind Teonna Rainwater's suffering. Teonna Rainwater, portrayed with heart-wrenching realism by Amina Neves, is a young Crow woman subjected to the relentless cruelty of the Catholic boarding school system. These institutions were part of the United States assimilationist policies aimed at erasing Indigenous cultures languages, and identities. From the late 19th century through much of the 20th century, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in schools designed to civilize them by stripping away their heritage. Like many real-life Native children, Teonna experiences physical violence, psychological torment, and cultural erasure. The nuns at the school, particularly Sister Mary, treat her with shocking brutality, forcing her to recite prayers in Latin, forbidding her from speaking her native tongue, and punishing her with beatings for any perceived disobedience. These scenes are difficult to watch, but they are rooted in reality. Many survivors of boarding schools have recounted similar experiences, where the simplest act of self-expression could be met with severe punishment. The U.S. government and Catholic Church operated these institutions under the belief that they were saving Indigenous children, but in truth, they were destroying entire generations. The goal was to eradicate Indigenous identities by forcibly assimilating children into Euro-American culture. Hair was cut short, traditional clothing was replaced with uniforms, and children were given new names. They were often forbidden from speaking their native languages, and if they resisted, they were met with severe physical and emotional abuse. The conditions were horrific: overcrowding, malnutrition, disease, and rampant sexual and physical abuse were all too common. The fight for survival. Teonna's resilience in 1923 speaks to the real-life strength of Indigenous children who resisted their oppressors. Her brutal beating at the hands of Sister Mary and Father Renaud is almost unbearable to watch, but it also serves as a powerful testament to the countless Native children who endured similar treatment. Teonna, unlike many, fights back. She refuses to submit to the oppression forced upon her, even when it puts her life at risk. The moment she retaliates, killing Sister Mary in an act of self-defense, marks a turning point. Instead of being a silent victim, Teonna takes control of her own fate. Her harrowing escape from the boarding school mirrors the real-life experiences of Indigenous children who risked everything to flee these institutions. Many children attempted to escape, hoping to return home to their families, but the consequences of being caught were often deadly. Some never made it out, perishing from starvation, exposure, or the hands of those who sought to reclaim and punish them. Teonna's journey is fraught with danger, as she is relentlessly pursued by authorities who see her not as a victim, but as a fugitive. Her story highlights the dehumanization Native children faced. Rather than acknowledging the cruelty inflicted upon them, society branded them as criminals or lost causes if they resisted. A legacy of trauma. The trauma Teonna endures does not exist in a vacuum. Her story represents the generational pain carried by Indigenous families who lost their children to these institutions. Survivors of boarding schools often grew up struggling with identity loss, mental health issues, and a deep-seated mistrust of institutions. Many were permanently separated from their families, unable to reconnect with their heritage, and left to navigate the world as strangers to their own people. The effects of these schools still resonate today. The discovery of unmarked graves at former boarding school sites across Canada and the United States has shed light on just how devastating these institutions were. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous children never returned home, their fates lost to time and secrecy. Families were left without answers, and entire communities were left to grapple with an immeasurable loss. By centering Teonna's story in 1923, the show does more than just depict history. It forces audiences to confront a truth that has long been buried. Her story is not one of passive suffering. It is one of strength, survival, and reclaiming identity in the face of brutal oppression. The importance of telling this story. Taylor Sheridan's decision to include Teonna Rainwater's harrowing journey in 1923 is significant. Westerns have long glorified frontier life while minimizing or outright ignoring the suffering of indigenous peoples. By dedicating an entire storyline to Teonna, 1923 subverts the traditional narrative and forces viewers to reckon with the brutal realities that have often been glossed over in historical fiction. Amina Neve's performance is especially important in bringing authenticity to the role. Before taking on the part, Neves consulted with her own family, many of whom had direct or indirect experiences with the boarding school system. Her portrayal is a deeply personal one, ensuring that Teonna's story is not just another fictionalized tragedy, but a deeply human and painfully real representation of history.